So it is now my pleasure to introduce Sara Mainville. Sara Mainville is a partner at the JFK Law, LLP. She works with First Nations and is one of the few practicing lawyers that works as much within Indigenous legal systems as within Aboriginal law and Canada. Sara has a Bachelor of Management from the University of Lethbridge and an LLB from Queen's University. And Sara chose to article at EcoJustice Canada. In addition to her legal practice, Sara has earned an LLM from the University of Toronto and was awarded the June Colwood Bursary for Graduate Studies in 2006-2007. Her thesis, An Anishinaabe Perspective of Treaty 3, was the beginning of a lifetime of study by her regarding Treaty 3 and Indigenous jurisdictions' important place in reconciling Indigenous sovereignty in Canada. In 2014, Sara was elected Chief of Couchiching First Nation after the sudden death of her friend and mentor, Chief Chuck McPherson. During that term, she ensured that the First Nation has a strong policy going forward, a good social media presence to engage many off-reserve members in the community affairs, and she started the WASA group of companies. Sara used this experience to help leadership work past difficult issues, help with internal dispute resolution, and walk the community through processes to encourage discourse and grassroots solutions to long-held problems. Sara Mainville is very proud of her participation in the negotiations that led to the creation of the First Nations Sovereign Wealth LP, FNSWLP, a partnership of 129 First Nations in Ontario. Directed by a Chiefs Committee on Energy, Sara was active in the negotiations that resulted in the commercial transaction between the province of Ontario and the FNSWLP of 14 million Hydro One shares and 21 million in seed capital to facilitate long-term wealth creation for the partnering First Nations. The lengthy discussions to transaction closing were completed between October 2015 and the final days of October 2017. Sara has completed advanced negotiations training at Harvard University and dispute resolution, legislative drafting, and mediation training at professional institutes in order to advance her clients' long-held goals for self-determination and truer treaty partnerships in Canada. So it is my great pleasure to welcome Sara Mainville to Lakehead University virtually today. And we're really, really pleased that you're able to join us today, Sara. Welcome.
Thank you. Bonjour. Kabamishi Pinisi Kwa Indigenous Kazmakwa, Dodem, Couchiching Nandoji. I'm happy to be here. I'm actually in the traditional territory of Fort William First Nation in a hotel room. So I hope that everything works out and that you're able to hear me and see me, and the presentation can be brought up now in order to share with you. There's a slide deck. Great. So this Manidoo Mazina'igan is the title of my LLM thesis, and I spent over a year going through papers held by Canada, as well as talking to members of the Grand Council Treaty 3 about Treaty 3, the relationship, and the idea of reconciliation. What does it, from the Anishinaabe perspective? You can go to the next slide, please. So the key points to today's talk is that treaties are the creation story of Canada. I don't know if that's provocative or not, but Canada has to have the maturity as a nation treaty partner to recognize their own creation story in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, the Treaty at Niagara, and those historic treaties that allowed for confederation to take place through the regions of Canada from east to west to the north. And that's really a story that has to be uncovered. And my thesis was about these really important documents, our records of the treaty made in 1873. And I'm going to explain some of them, but I'm also going to put them in their proper place, I hope. And also recognizing that the second point, on October 3rd, 1873, a treaty was made in Indigenous law, Anishinaabe and Oknagewan, as well as British law. And that was achieved for both parties. But both parties have to continue to come together. It's a relationship. And that coming together in what I would call Treaty Council, that coming together will bridge the understandings of that historic reconciliation in a modern way, to be of one mind in Treaty 3. That's the importance of the treaty relationship. Indigenous understanding of treaties is the bonds become stronger. We have a closer and closer relationship, to almost familiarity, to be family members, and to create mutual benefits by that relationship through the sharing of treaty territory. The third point is that the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3, the Boundary Waters Anishinaabe, as they were known historically, are the Indigenous nation that made treaty in 1873. The British, to be clear, the British were the other nation. It wasn't Canada. And certainly no other Indigenous nation was involved in Treaty 3. I think there's some misinterpretation going on about some of the discussions that happened in 1873 that we need to really understand the Anishinaabe perspective of Treaty 3 to come to terms with that. And of course, fourth and final, here are the sacred documents. It's not only the articles of treaty. I'm going to put that in the proper place, but it's also this Manitoba newspaper account, the shorthand reporter's account, the Nolan notes, the PAPOM document, Simon Dawson's notes, and the list of the 1869 list of demands. These are all Manidoo Mazina'igan from that 1873 treaty conference. And I'm going to go through some of them, as well as the important case of Grassy Narrows that went through the Supreme Court of Canada around a treaty understanding and a concept about who the Crown was that unfortunately I think was misunderstood by the Supreme Court of Canada. But I'm going to relay the important decisions and the important understanding and recognition of Treaty 3 that was in the trial decision that's so important to the historic recollection, the mutual recollection of what the treaty was and what that historic reconciliation was in 1873. We can go to the next slide. So I'm going to start off with this because I think it's really important to understand that when we're talking about treaty revitalization and implementation of the treaty, self-determination for the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3, we're always talking about coexistence. I think the elephant in the room when the Department of Justice or when Canada talks about things like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and self-determination, they think we're going to talk about succession, about leaving our relationship, our treaty relationship with Canada. And just to remind people how important treaty is, especially to my nation, the Anishinaabe Nation of the Boundary Waters. It's so important that like everything that we talk about, we always talk about in terms of Treaty 3. It's very important. And this is advice given by Elder Fred Kelly. And it's in important reconciliation document about with the resettlement of Indian residential schools. And one thing that he says is, you know, there are several international conflicts out there, but this is not what our treaty and our relationship is about. We can choose a win or lose relationship, or we can choose what was decided in 1873 that will live side by side. We're friends and we're neighbors. Sure, we have tensions, but we have a relationship of coexistence. We have ingredients or a recipe to live together, and that's Treaty 3. This is home to all of us. But how do we build a future of prosperity together? We're economically interdependent. We have many social ties. Our children are married to one another. So given all these options, there's one that's very clear and simple. We can all win or we can all lose. And that's the nature of the talk that I'm going to give today, is how we can all win in understanding the real history of Treaty 3 through these sacred recordings of what happened in 1873. Next slide. So one thing that we have to recognize, and this is something is both a Canadian trained lawyer and someone who has received some training by knowledge keepers in Anishinaabe and Oknageewin, is that Our relationship with law is quite different. So the Anishinaabe relationship with law and the Crown relationship with law is law's role in our societies are quite different. So for the Anishinaabe, the treaty is about relationship and interdependencies and those win-wins and stronger ties and having a more mature relationship. I know as children, we want to be as independent as possible, but as we grow older, as we become parents, we realize that interdependency is the maturing of relationships. And that's something that we've learned through not only our teachings, but also our relationships and our experience. The Crown in the British legal order is more transactional. That's why we have to rely on concepts like fiduciary duty and the honor of the Crown to make things right. Because of course, there'll be sharp dealing, there'll be unfair transactions, and we need remedies. We need the law to be enforceable because we can't rely on human nature and solidarity behind law to create human relationships that are just, fair, and reciprocal. Our Anishinaabe legal order is based on harmony and a natural order. Dispute resolution, of course, happens, but it's all about maintaining balance and keeping the peace. Whereas in the Crown, again, back to the situation of that transactional focus, the laws relies on compliance to rules and remedies in a justice system. And that's why taking treaties to court seems ill-suited or awkward, because it really, it seems upside down in a treaty relationship that you have to go to court to get your treaty partner to do the things that they long ago promised to do. In Anishinaabe society, I'm going to use this term sui generis, of its own kind, but not in the perspective of how sui generis is utilized in treaty law, in Aboriginal law, in Canadian courts. It really is of its own kind. It's of Anokanagewan teachings, of legal teachings. And these arrangements are very specific to the relationships and to how vulnerable one party is to another. And so that's really important. It's about protection and it's about reciprocity as well. The Crown recognizes that in some respects, their law is ill-suited for Indigenous legal orders. And that's why they'll talk about things like treaty implementation through coordination agreements. And that's the hard work that we're all doing under Bill C-92 with child welfare laws. In order to make the Crown fulfill their obligations, we have to have these contracts or coordination agreements to make sure that the Crowns fulfill their obligations and make the space for Indigenous jurisdiction to actually be operational. So in the Anishinaabe society, we talk about Manidoo and what the Creator has given us. All of these teachings, these wonderful, very rich instructions from the Creator that are held in our language. Anishinaabe is our inheritance. And it's so important for us to get that language back because our knowledge system is very much part of that language. And understanding our constitutional legal order is impossible without utilizing our language. The Crown, again, relies on Section 35 to do all the work. But Section 35 has been, it's fairly in an empty state, and relying on Indigenous peoples to do all the heavy lifting in Section 35 isn't practical. And we need to do much more work to just make space for Indigenous jurisdiction. And that's some of the hard work we have to do in implementing treaties. Next slide, please. So when I started my Master's of Law thesis, I knew very much about this book. It was something that I utilized writing most of my undergraduate papers in public policy and in public administration. I utilized this book, which was by Lieutenant Governor Alexander Morris, who negotiated many of the numbered treaties in Canada from east to west, Treaty 1 and 2 being in Manitoba and Treaty 3 being in northwestern Ontario and southern Manitoba. Alexander Morris has several chapters, including a chapter on Treaty 3 that includes much of the content of Manidoo, Mazina'igan. The book actually establishes that there are several contemporary accounts in writing taken of the September 30th to October 3rd, 1873 discussions between my nation, the Anishinaabe Nation, and the British officials for Canada that resulted in the treaty on October 3rd. There was also some literate French Métis from, I think, Wisconsin. The Nolan notes were taken. They were actually hired by the Anishinaabe to take notes in French. Those notes were actually shared with Alexander Morris, who had an English translation quickly done up and took the English translated document with him and included it in his book. But also, we don't know where that French document is or if it still exists. I think it'd be very, very important if it does exist to find it. The Manitoba newspaper uses the shorthand reporter's account, and it printed the story of Treaty 3 making in the Northwest Eagle at the same time a treaty was being made in 1873. And two of the three treaty commissioners, Simon Dawson and Alexander Morris, both wrote accounts of their experience in making Treaty 3 at the same time. Simon Dawson, for me, has the most, I think, accurate set of notes. I prefer his note taking because he actually spent years with the Anishinaabe before treaty making and understood some of the protocols, and some of the places are some of the leaders and probably understood their perspective of treaty making probably better than anyone else that took notes at the same time. Next slide. So I want to explain sort of the context before treaty, and this is actually it's important to understand this. And when the Treaty 3 litigation in Grassy Narrows was brought forward, there was quite a lengthy history of what would the perspectives be of the Crown, what would be the perspectives of the Anishinaabe, setting the context before treaty. And of course, there was the Riel Rebellion and other things, conflict in the West that really required there to be movement of supplies as well as troops from Montreal to Winnipeg and further west, and that required no longer using the Minnesota the Minnesota route, which was being utilized before the 1860s, and using a new route through northwestern Ontario, then called the Dawson route. And that's how Simon Dawson got his early relationship with the Anishinaabe. And this one account in 1871 just shares that context, and that there was actually already an agreement that was made. It was a $3 annuity made in Fort Frances for this movement of troops and supplies into through British territory, because of course in Minnesota that was American territory. And this right of way, known as the Dawson route, was some portages, but mostly a canoe route through what's known as Treaty 3 territory, or Manitoba Key. An important discussion was in 1870, and this is relayed by Simon Dawson. The chief's communications was basically that they were open to a treaty. We're willing to allow people the right to pass through our territory, the right to build, some public works, but we don't want settlement here. We want to be able to, go about our own business. We want to be able to hunt and fish and cut timber for the waterways, and continue to, keep our economic advantage in maintaining our territory for ourselves. And that basically was relayed, including the discussion again of the fact that the $3 annuity wasn't necessarily happening as promised even at that time. Next slide. So this is all understood in the trial decision at Grassy Narrows. The idea that there are these contemporary accounts in 1873 about what the treaty was, what was agreed to, beyond what was not included in the Articles of Treaty, or the document that Canada pretends is the treaty between Canada and the Anishinaabe. One of the things that the judge accepts in the trial decision is Dawson's account that the Treaty 3 Ojibwe were very different from other Indigenous peoples, and therefore had stronger claims, and probably Canada had to be aware that they needed a stronger negotiation strategy to get to a treaty with the Anishinaabe of the boundary waters. And that, in fact, is why there is a Treaty 1 and a Treaty 2 west of this territory, because Treaty 1 can be made in the Northwest Angle until 1873. There was a hard bargain to be made. Another thing that I want to mention is I would put in place the Articles of the Treaty in the same standing as these 1869 demands. Canada or the British were trying to make treaty with the Anishinaabe, and the Anishinaabe knew full well, because their cousins in Minnesota had already made a treaty and actually had a pretty good deal in their treaty. And the Anishinaabe were reflecting on whether that was a good path to follow. And so, utilizing their relationships, they created this list of demands in 1869 to get ready for a treaty council that happened, or a treaty conference that happened in 1870. And these 1869s, list of demands I'm going to share with you, but those are basically the positions of both parties. They're at the same space. The Articles of Treaty created by Canada was also drafted in 1870, but it had space placeholders for more to be added in negotiations. And I think the Anishinaabe were also of the same mind, that they would present their demands or their position as negotiation strategy and be open to give and take. And so I would just put those two alongside each other. The Articles of a Treaty with the X's on it from 1873 and the 1869 demands. They're just the positions of the two parties and nothing more. And that's discussed in this trial decision. One of the things that the court gives as good advice for anyone talking about implementing Treaty 3 is paragraph 215 of this trial decision. In considering a mutual intention in 1873, it would not be acceptable to uncritically adopt Euro-Canadian interpretations of the Ojibwe perception contained in these documents. The Ojibwe could not read or write English, and since the memory record of the negotiations taken by an Indigenous recorder has not survived, expert historical, ethno-historical, and anthropological evidence was called to assist this court in gleaning the Aboriginal understanding of their intentions, interests, and objectives. The Ojibwe perspective of the treaty that was entered into. There's more to be learned, and I doubt that memory record doesn't exist. It does exist. We're just not talking to the right people to find out that Indigenous recording of the oral history or the oral tradition of Treaty 3. Next slide, please. So the courts have been dealing with the problems of the Section 35 tests and how they limit and undermine the transformative promise of Section 35 in protecting treaty rights. And many times the Crown goes to court and tries to utilize their unjust activities of the Indian Act, settler colonialism, all of these things that Aboriginal peoples have suffered, to utilize those things against us with things like oral tradition, evidence tests, evidentiary tests in general. The fact that we've gone through generations of intergenerational trauma all of those things. And the court here, in this case in 2021, tries to correct that and recognize that the common law was already doing this hard work in Section 35. And we're missing the transformative promise of Section 35 by not allowing the laws to come through, the Indigenous laws to come through. And that Indigenous perspective is so important in understanding Indigenous rights. And so that's why I want to bring attention to this case. Next slide, please. So in my thesis and the work that I'm doing now for Treaty 3, I'm talking about reinvigorating these treaty councils, not just the treaty councils themselves, because there's another piece that's really important to it, and that's that in legal ordering, that side-by-side legal ordering, when the parties go away from the treaty council and try to meet the commitments and the reciprocity that's meant for modern implementation of the treaty. So just in my treaty research, clearly from 1874 to 1886, this is just before this awful case. You want to learn about the doctrine of discovery, go to St. Catharines Milling and Lumber Company. This decision that was made in 1888 by an English High Court, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. That's 1888 decision is why these treaty councils stopped. But there was from 1874 to 1886, the few years after treaty was made, there were treaty councils where the chiefs, delegations of chiefs met with Lieutenant Governor Morse and about Treaty 3 in Winnipeg. One intervention, for example, was about the plight of Sitting Bull, as an example. So there was truly, the chiefs seen this as a nation-to-nation dialogue to talk about national affairs with their treaty partner. But the second part of it, beyond the treaty councils, is this idea of juris genesis, the idea that we're creating a common legal order for the treaty relationship to flourish. And so this is an end in 1873. It's actually just beginning. And it's the commitment of the nations to go back to within their own legal traditions and honor, recognize, and respect the jurisdictions of their treaty partner and the plans of their treaty partner. So why don't we see in Ontario legislation to protect inherent rights to hunt and fish and trap by the Anishinaabe in Treaty 3? Why isn't there legislation to meet the treaty obligations? Why isn't the Crown holding themselves to task within the Canadian legal order to meet the commitments in Treaty 3? Specifically, education is one of them. Health is another. But this is the only way that we're going to have side-by-side reconciliation, is we demand of our two nations to make sure that we, in fact, are keeping ourselves accountable within our own legal orders and upholding the honor of our own society, the honor of the Crown, the importance of meeting the sacred obligations and treaty in the Anishinaabe and Okanagan legal tradition to implement the treaties. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about this really important document called the PAPOM document. I sometimes hear, especially youth, talk about it as the PAPOM Treaty. And I just want to explain something about the PAPOM document. And I'm doing this very respectfully. It definitely is a very important document. It definitely has a spirit. And the spirit is of finalizing treaty. The PAPOM document was a document that was written probably before October 2nd, or at the end of the day, October 2nd, when the Anishinaabe were deciding whether or not they were going to walk away again from treaty. They had done this in the past in 1870 and 1872. Were they going to do that again? This document was probably something, and I've heard this from an elder, put the document on the floor and you talk about it. And so this is probably went to ceremony, this PAPOM document, but it was before October 3rd, 1873. And the reason why I say that is because it doesn't include the education guarantee. There's no discussion of education in the PAPOM document. But the PAPOM document says some very important things about the Anishinaabe perspective, what the Anishinaabe thought that they had earned in negotiations by the end of day, October 2nd, 1873. The government will give, when Indians have settled, 2 hoes, 1 plow for every 10 families, 5 harrows for every 20 families, 1 yoke of oxen, 1 bull, 4 cows for every band, 1 scythe and 1 axe for every family. There will be no sale of liquor. You'll get rations during the time of the payment, the treaty payment each year. The treaty will last as long as the sun will shine, the water runs, that is to say forever. Regarding the reserves, regarding mining, if some gold mines or silver mines be found in the reserves, it will be for the benefit of the Indians. But if the Indians find any gold or silver off of their reserves, they'll surely be paid for it. So this pay palm document is incredibly important because the spirituality around this document, I think, is very, very, very significant. But it isn't, doesn't have the full scope of the treaty terms in it. So I would not call it the Pay Palm Treaty, but it's a very important document for sure. Next slide, please. So the Articles of a Treaty. So this is a copy of the one in held in the archives. The important document that I think the Anishinaabe Nation should have back. So this was drafted in 1870, and there were some placeholders for new considerations in the treaty. It's incomplete at best, and probably a bit of sharp dealing at worst, because it wasn't all the terms in the treaty weren't shared with the Anishinaabe. There is no account, no single account where a surrender was ever explained, read, interpreted, or translated to the Anishinaabe in 1873. It was never discussed. Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples says very clearly in Volume 2, if you have no proof of consent to a surrender, don't rely on it. And so that's the hard discussions that we have to have in terms of coming to one mind on the treaty. This is a position paper from Canada. It is not the treaty. It may have some X's on it. My understanding of the X's is the leaders touched the pen, because you got to understand they're not reading and writing in English. Holding a pen is not something that many of them have done, if any of them have done before. So they touched the pen, and then somebody else made the X. So in Canadian law, that's important. So I just want to explain that. But it hasn't been signed, in my understanding, by the leaders, by the Gichita, by the Gima of Treaty 3. But the important thing is, I would just put it at the same standing as the 1869 list of demands from the Anishinaabe. It's what both parties wanted, but what was achieved was an oral agreement. Next slide, please. So here are the 1869 list of demands. I love going back to this this document. I have a copy of the document that was from the archives, and it's something that was, again, it was written before 1873. It was the position of the chiefs in consultation with their cousins in Minnesota, other Anishinaabe, and probably some folks from Fort William. You know, Nicholas Chatelain, his mother was from Fort William First Nation. So probably, you know, some discussions about treaty making. And so this is the list of demands. It's really important. The copy that I have in the archives actually has a notation on it written in ink by someone that was actually computing at the time in 1873 what this list of demands would cost. And the number was $126,000. It's an important part of the evidentiary record of what was being asked for by the Anishinaabe from their perspective, what they were agreeing to. Was it just 2 passages, one being the Dawson route, the other being the CPR railway route? Or I don't know how anybody can come to a final thinking or thought that this was about a surrender, because it was never mentioned at the 1873 treaty conference by Canada or others. Next slide, please. So through the work of some ethno-historians, this one is Joan Lovesek, who was working for Grassy Narrows, or wasn't working for Grassy Narrows, is an expert, wasn't working for anyone, but was giving objective advice on the historic record, is a expert ethno-historian. And she looked at Manidoo Mazina'igan, she looked at the Dawson notes, she looked at the Morse's document, she looked at the shorthand reporter's notes. And this is important because this again is about the Grassy Narrows litigation was about clear cutting and impacting inherent hunting, fishing, and trapping rights of the Trappers Council in Grassy Narrows. So she looks at this for the trial record and looks at the inconsistency about this one passage in the Morse document. Free is by the pass for their hunting and rice harvest, and tracking it through all those different contemporary notes being made in 1873. She notes that actually Simon Dawson was the one that was speaking during this part of the negotiations, and only noted, after the fact, happy to do what he could to help the Indians. He made that personal notation probably for himself, but it wasn't deemed to be the full record of what was actually discussed. And I just wanted to mention, this is an opinion of the expert, Joan Lovesek. For Dawson, the activities of hunting and wild rice gathering would probably not have been considered terms that could be granted by a treaty. Of course, it's our inherent rights, it's our Inakanagewan. Since hunting, fishing, and gathering were significant components of the Saulteaux culture at and before the time of the treaty, and reported by Dawson in the several reports, perhaps Dawson did not understand that these rights would be extinguished or regulated or capable of being regulated. So the comparison to the contemporary record happens throughout the Grassy Narrows case at trial. And there's important reflections on some of the inconsistencies in the reporting. And of course, you have to take into account the perspective of the different individuals taking the notes. The Nolan notes, of course, they have some Anishinaabe cultural understanding. Simon Dawson also has a bit of perspective, understanding of the Anishinaabe perspective, because of his relationship and experience working with the Agitchita and others in the Boundary Waters Anishinaabe. But Morris also has a very transactional view of the treaty. So you can just sort of highlight those differences when you look at the different records in Manidoo Mazina'igan. Next slide, please. So I also want to go back to this case, the Sautel. This is a case about the tribe that was once in the BC region that was forced out, and the individual was hunting and I think was fishing in BC, despite being seen as an American Indian by Canadian law, and found to have a continuing Section 35 right. And again, this is really important to think about, but also to recognize that the courts certainly have their limits, but they're trying to move forward with a more transformative Section 35. And I like that the courts see themselves as guardians of the Constitution, but it's a Constitution full packed of individual rights and less understanding of collective rights, and certainly less understanding of treaty rights, our treaty relationships. But I like this second paragraph, that Section 35 will be implemented according to Indigenous people's own laws, customs, and practices. And I think that's, there's an opportunity there, and I'm positive about that reflection. Next slide. So another question that I've always had is, who was sovereign in the 55,000 square miles of treaty territory that we now call Manitouaki in 1873? Certainly the Canadians see themselves, the British see themselves as sovereign. But in actuality, Who was making the rules? Who was deciding when and where they could meet? Who was deciding when the treaty conference was ended? Who was deciding how they would meet? Who was deciding the protocols in Indigenous diplomacy? It was the Anishinaabe for sure. The indigenous peoples of the Boundary Waters, the Anishinaabe, were constantly policing. I mean, that's the role of the Igichuta, boundary warrior, making the peace, but also protecting the nation. And so I look at this Dawson letter in 1872. You got to take it in its own cultural time and cultural understanding. But just the reflection that they seem fully alive to their interests in evidence. Sorry, there's a typo though. There, evidence no small amount of intelligence in maintaining their views. We've made them liberal presents and provisions, tobacco, etc., and have parted with them on good terms and understanding that we're not to negotiate with separate bands. That was always in Treaty 3, the constant instructions from the chiefs, from the Igichuta. Do not treat with individual bands. You were to meet with us as a nation in Grand Council, and that was respected. But the actual actions by the Canadians, by the British. So the Morse document is accepted as a fill-in-the-blank treaty. This is at paragraph 318 in the Grassy Narrows trial decision. Because the treaty was completed in an hour, is reflected in Morse's document. It actually was a template in sort of filled in the blanks of some of the matters that were agreed to that was important to Canada to be obliged to honor some of it. And then there was also these so-called outside promises that were also made in Treaty 3 that had to go to litigation. I want to mention that the articles of a treaty is actually based on a British legal form called a quitclaim deed. A quitclaim deed, you utilize that when you have a nuisance, when you have somebody that might be claiming to have rights in land that you want to purchase. So you do a quitclaim just to get rid of that nuisance. And that's actually reflective of how Canadians at the time in 1873 seen Aboriginal title as a nuisance. And that's problematic, and that's misunderstanding Indigenous law for sure, and as well British imperial law. Next slide, please. So a little bit more before as I wrap up about what could have happened. One of the important aspects of the treaty making that the Anishinaabe is sure reflected on October 2nd, 1873, when they were thinking in council, in Grand Council, of whether or not they should walk away this time again, was this, that Lieutenant Governor Morse said to Anishinaabe, it may be a long time before the other lands are wanted, and in the meantime, you'll be permitted to fish and hunt over them. How was that interpreted? Basically, you can go about your business. You can continue, we don't have any interest in your land. We want these two lines. We want the CPR line, the Dawson route to continue, and we want to be able to peacefully go through your territory. And you get the treaty. And that's a problem. The other thing I mentioned was the St. Catharines milling case. St. Catharines milling case went from trial to the Court of Appeal to the Supreme Court to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in England without any participation of the Anishinaabe. And I like this paragraph by Sidney Haring, who wrote this great book called White Man's Law at page 138, that Morse could have, definitely given testimony about his experience in treaty making, that the Anishinaabe were seeing themselves as owners of the land. And that this assumption that Chancellor Boyd, who made this awful racist trial decision in St. Catharines milling, I wouldn't even want to take you through it. The language is so obscene, but it could have refuted a lot of the misunderstanding and caricature of Indigenous peoples' rights and titles in that case, and could have been better decided on behalf of the Aboriginal title and getting rid of this awful doctrine of discovery from the get-go. Next slide, please. So why Manidoo, Mazina'igan? Why is it so important to continue to go back to these papers? I know we are oral tradition, we have our Nakanagewin, but we hold fast to our treaties, the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3, we're the Grand Council Treaty 3, we're the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3. Treaty 3, you see folks, they look like a retired baseball team. They're all walking around with these Treaty 3 logos on their back. It's very important to us. It's core to our identity. Because the treaty was made in the presence of our ancestors, our most sacred spiritual helpers, and of course the creator on October 3rd, 1873. It was a great deal at the time. We had a position that amounted to $126,000, and we decided what we achieved on October 3rd was more valuable than that. So you have to take that into consideration. The documents to be discussed, hearing this from an elder, you put them on the floor and talk about them in the old way in the Treaty Council. Let's do that with Canada on September 30th to October 3rd, 2023. That's the 150th anniversary of Treaty 3. And that PAPOM document, I think has such a very important spirit, and it still exists. And can you imagine that October 2nd, 1873 discussion that our ancestors had in ceremony and council? All the pipes, all the drums, our ancestors. I know that there was other ceremonial items that were there. That document is key to coming to one mind on Treaty 3. And we should use our cultural ways to bring all that back. And I'm sure that that memory of that Indigenous recorder will come back in full color. Next slide. I want to mention these 3 articles of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because this might get us further. I know that we were attempting to have these discussions, engagements with Canada on the UN Declaration and implementing it. Here are 3 articles that are very important to that. Article 27, for sure. Article 19, in that idea that we do have treaty councils, but it's the responsibility of Canada to bring their obligations back into their law, and for us as Anishinaabe to bring back our commitments and respect for Canadian coexistence into our law as well. So these articles are very important. Next slide. But we have to keep reminding ourselves that Canada is not a mature nation. They haven't dealt with treaty relationships in a mature way in any form. They're happy to come and pay $5. They're happy to bring a fishing net to the Treaty 3 communities. They're happy to rely on the surrender that never was explained to the Anishinaabe in 1873. They're happy to have the doctrines of discovery. They're doing nothing to get rid of the doctrine of discovery. And courts are wondering, you know, is this really where we're going? Is this the real trajectory? And then remembering that Canada is still not that mature nation. And this court, Justice Kent said this in BC. It remains to be seen whether the passage of the UNDRIP legislation is simply vacuous political bromide, or whether it heralds a substantive change in the common law respecting Aboriginal rights. But he's bound by the common law, and he can't make those changes himself. And so we are stuck with courts upholding this immature lens on treaty relationships until we get real change in legislation. Next slide, please. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm very happy to hear questions about my presentation and reflections on Treaty 3. Miigwech.
Miigwech, thank you so much for sharing that. It was I mean, I know there's probably years of work in your master's thesis when you did that work, and the work you continue to do, but certainly really interesting, just even some of the nuances of the language, like the PAPOM treaty versus the PAPOM document, for instance, was one that stood out as I was listening. We do have a few minutes though, if we have any questions from the group. I know we have quite a large number of people here listening. We maybe have time for 1 or 2 or possibly 3 questions. So if anyone would either like to pose a question in the chat or put your hand up and make yourself, then I'll watch the chat for you. I mean, I'll watch the hands up option. Just give. We have a comment. Thank you for bringing the language, the history of the Anishinaabe perspective and the documents alive. And for those who are asking about the presentation, it is going to be recorded, so you can certainly access then. All right, we do have a question from Couchiching First Nation. So if you would like to unmute yourself and ask the question, go ahead.
Bonjour, Sagatuwe, Nigo, Bijou Totem, Couchiching Donji, Wanatongan Donji. Good morning. My name is Brian Perro. I'm the chief of Couchiching, and I'm so proud and happy of Sara and the presentation, and it gives me hope, you know, for a better relationship and for our treaty partners to have a better understanding of how we see, you know, we call it Manidoo, Mazina'igan, you know, the spirit paper, the treaty documents. And I just want to say how proud I am, myself and Sandy Breer with me, a counselor for our community, that Sara has done such wonderful work and research, and it's really going to help us at the Grand Council. So Chimigwech, Sara, and Chimigwech to everyone that's listening. I think this is going to be, you know, things that we can use going forward. So Miigwech.
Miigwech, Chief. Thank you very much.
Thank
Making
you
me
so
weepy.
I'd like to invite Art Hunter to speak.
Bonjour. Gitagi Jignindigo, I think them Manitou Baut the Gundandonji. Descendant of Beskonkin Reserve. I found it. I want to say Miigwech, Sara, for your presentation. A lot of things, including I've always heard about this PAPOM document, he said, which is not a treaty. So, and you talked about them creating this document on the 2nd of October, the day before the actual treaty was signed. And so I think people are under the impression that there was an actual treaty that was made, which was we think what I thought was the PAPOM treaty that was had a whole bunch of things in it which the people wanted, but the government said, oh yeah, okay, we'll take that, but they changed it to suit their own, like the government changed it and kind of tricked the people in saying, you know, okay, we'll take your document, but we're not going to honor it. So that's kind of I was under the impression that these were two different treaties.
Yeah, I don't want to confuse anybody because it's only my opinion, and I'm still trying to fully understand the PAPOM document. So the PAPOM document, why I wouldn't say that the PAPOM document is the treaty document, because it doesn't include the very important education guarantee. And why does it include the education guarantee? Because that was achieved on the final day, October 3rd. And so everything else was achieved beforehand. So there was a very important, there was an abrupt end to October 2nd. So during that abrupt end, the British officials asked some of the half-breed interpreters if they could go and help the Anishinaabe understand what they had achieved. And I think that's the PAPOM document. I think that's the utility of that PAPOM document, that it was trying to bring an understanding to what had been achieved at that time, the evening of October 2nd, 1873. And that they could get more, but they needed to go back. They couldn't walk away. And I think that's, and I can imagine the discussion, the importance of the discussion. I've been part of really important long evening discussions at Grand Council, and I know how important that discussion is. People don't want to leave those tables. And so that's the PAPOM document. In my mind, it is only my mind. I don't think we're all of one mind about that PAPOM document. And again, I haven't seen it. I've been in the same room with it, but I haven't actually looked at it. I'd be so honored to be able to do that. But it still exists. It's very important. It's probably got more spirituality than the Articles of a Treaty, because it went through all that discussion, that important spirit and that energy, that ceremony. But it doesn't include the education guarantee. There's a couple of other things that it doesn't include that I think are very important Canadian obligations under Treaty 3. So that's the only reason I wouldn't call it the PAPOM Treaty.
Thank you. We have 1 minute left. I just wanted to do a quick, we had a question in the chat saying, do you think the conflict of laws principles would validly allow Indigenous law to be applied by Canadian courts, or does that leave too much power within the Crown machinery?
That's a
really big question.
That's a really big question for a little bit of time. I think it's an awkward instrument. I really do think it's treaty councils that are the better form rather than courts. But we probably still need, again, courts to help us get all the procedural rights in place to have a proper fair dealing type of treaty council. And then again, those legal ordering to happen consistently every year after treaty councils.
Wonderful. Well, I'd like to extend Sara for bringing to us information, knowledge that is both spiritual, historical, and current community, as we heard from the chief of your community as well, and what that means in moving forward in those relationships. And appreciate the concept about the courts being awkward and not really the place to engage in spiritual work between two parties that have come to an agreement that is grounded in ceremony. So, with that, thinking of what that means moving forward, I just appreciated that, hearing that. I come from a Treaty 9, and so that is, a different kind of treaty, certainly, but nonetheless, one that's very important to us from that territory, but also, the rest of the country. And so I would just like to extend our thanks, wish you safe travels home today. I'm glad the weather is not snowing for you, and you should have a nice drive home and back to be in your community and honoring your family on Remembrance Day on Friday. So I'd just like to again thank everyone for joining us. For those who are available tomorrow, we have the former Mushkegowuk Grand Council Chief Jonathan Solomon, who will be speaking at 10 o'clock in the morning on Treaty 9, the real agreement that was orally agreed to. So please go to lakeheadu.ca/Indigenous to find the link and register. And please join me in a hearty thank you and miigwech to Sara for joining us today. Thank you so much.